So, we're talking about the witch again.
And that's because this time around in the Pathfinder 2e Remaster, I want to add a new type of video alongside the deep dives. It's one thing to go through the entire chapter and tell y'all about every little individual detail about a class, but I don't get to focus too long on what I do and don't like about the class, outside of a few little statements here and there. So, we are adding a second video series that is a companion series to the deep dives. Welcome to Is It Any Good? This is where I'd throw a title sequence, if I had one, or the budget to make one. It's the witch. So, in case you haven't watched it, if you want the long form of this class, click this right here in the corner. That'll take you to my hour-long witch deep dive where you learn everything about the class. In this video, we're going to focus on some very specific aspects of the class and mainly ask the specific question, is the new witch any good in the Pathfinder 2e Remaster? Now, if you've watched videos like this about a game like D&D, talking about which subclass is the best or whatever, this is going to be very different, and that's because Pathfinder 2e is so inherently balanced that most of this discussion is not going to be about numbers. There will still be some numbers talk, trust me. But overall, as long as you're not taking voluntary flaws in your key ability score, you're going to be just as accurate as anybody else your level except the fighter.
Hey!
No, instead, something being good in Pathfinder 2e usually comes down to either being able to hit for massive numbers in a single action, fighters, or having access to a bunch of different stuff on the same character. There's obviously a lot to be said about the synergistic power of classes. Nothing's more synergistic than the Bard, who just makes everybody else better. Though in a vacuum, it's hard to justify how synergistically powerful something is. So I'll do my best to keep synergy potential in mind when talking about things, but a lot of what we discuss here is in a vacuum, because a vacuum is sort of the only way to think about a class, because you can't think about every single possible situation and combination of party members out there. So how does the witch stack up in the remaster, and is it worth you picking one up to play? Well, let's talk about some of its most key features. It is a prepared spellcaster, meaning if you don't want to keep track of the specific spells you think you might need to cast that day, don't play it. Prepared spellcasting is a hassle in Pathfinder 2e and has not been changed in the remaster. Now remember, one person's hassle is another person's puzzle, and they love that. The people who play prepared spellcasters and love to think, okay, I'm gonna do 3 magic missiles, I'm gonna do 2 burning hands, a polymorph, and a lightning bolt. They love that kind of thing. It's like they're shopping at Costco and they need to ration out how many frozen pizzas they need that week. And the witch adds a whole new dimension to it because your subclass determines which list you're preparing from, and not in the same way as something like a cleric or druid. A cleric and druid can always prepare any spell from their tradition. You're a cleric at level 1, every single level 1 divine spell is available to you. But you're a witch? No. You only get to know 5, and then you have to prepare 2 of them at level 1, and as you level up, you'll learn more. So a witch using the divine spell list is actually far more limited than something like a cleric. But why then would you play the witch? Well, because of their hexes and familiar abilities. Outside of some very specific archetypes or other feats, having a divine caster with a familiar is not super common. Clerics are not offered familiars. Sorcerers, I think, can get a familiar, but it's a big feat sink. Meanwhile, you are a witch with a divine patron, boom, you've already got the familiar at level 1, and it gets extra abilities per day. So already right away, if you want to be a caster with a powerful familiar, play the witch. Sure, the wizard can do that with arcane, but they're stuck to arcane. If you want to be occult, primal, or divine with a really powerful familiar right off the bat, the witch is your single best option, and that makes it great. It gives it this really nice sense of identity that, honestly, it had pre-remaster. I just didn't hear a lot of people talking about it. But what about these hexes? What about these special spells available to the witch? Well, they are insane. Mostly. They've got so many things going for them. First off, they're all one action. Maybe not all of them, might be a couple 2 action hexes, but most of them are 1 action to cast. If you're familiar with the system, 1 action spells are super rare. I would wager they make up less than 10% of all of the spells in PF2. So already hexes have a leg up because they're a low action cost. Add on top of that, that they are all saving throw based, unless they're a buff to an ally. I don't believe there are any attack roll hexes, and this is a great thing, usually. Also, depending on the kind of player you are. You see, remember in PF2, there's the multiple attack penalty, meaning if you attack twice per turn, the second attack is going to be at -5, and this applies to spell attack rolls too. But as long as the spells call for a saving throw and not an attack roll, like with the hexes, then you can hex first and then cast something like a Scorching Ray right afterwards. You got the saving throw on your hex, so you don't take an attack penalty on your Scorching Ray. It's a great little combo there for witches. But I also mentioned it depends on the kind of player you are, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. The witch is very dependent on everybody else rolling dice. Unless you are specifically using your prepared spell slots to make some attack rolls and damage rolls, your hexes are either just going to give your allies a buff or make enemies roll saving throws, usually not against damage. There's a couple of examples of damaging effects, but usually you're going to say, I use this hex. The GM makes a saving throw for the enemy, and then whatever happens, happens. You're not rolling that many dice unless you specifically pick spell slot spells to roll dice, like Fireball. So keep that in mind when playing the Witch. It's very likely you'll have a lot of turns where you don't roll a single dice in combat. And that's not a bad thing for everybody, just for some people, myself included. I like rolling my own dice. Saving throws are not my cup of tea. Now there is a limiting factor. First off, there's hex spells and hex cantrips. Hex spells are typically a lot stronger, but they cost a focus point, you know how it is. But it's very cool that similar to a bard, the witch does get focus cantrips, hex cantrips, that they can cast as much and as often as they want, and these are really powerful effects, usually inflicting some kind of status condition or changing the parameters of combat as a whole, combining it with their new familiar abilities they got in the remaster, which can completely control the battlefield. Things like the Starless Shadow familiar that just keeps enemies permanently frightened for the entirety of combat is nuts. Though, not all of these are created equal, and that's because you do need to pick a patron. Your patron is your subclass as a witch, and I really wish I could say that all the patrons are balanced, created equal, and that there's no wrong choice, but there is a wrong choice. And it's the Silence and Snow patron. Please, for the love of God, do not pick Silence in Snow. Just pick the Wilding Steward. They're both nature spell lists with the primal spell list. Just the Silence and Snow's hex cantrip is so weak and feels so bad. At least Wilding Steward has some self-preservation. All the Silence and Snow does is slow the target if you're lucky and they fail. Otherwise, you're dealing half of 1d4. And it doesn't even have a good familiar ability. The Silence and Snow just creates a 2x2 block of difficult terrain squared on your familiar, which means if you want to put the enemy in difficult terrain, your familiar needs to be right up next to them when you cast your hex cantrip and then stick them in the difficult terrain. Like, yeah, there's that cool idea for a combo where you stick them in difficult terrain. As you cast Clinging Ice, they fail, getting -5 to their movement speed, so now they only have a 20-foot movement speed that turn, and they're in difficult terrain, so moving out of it costs 10 feet of movement instead of 5, and maybe you can hinder one move action. But the problem is your familiar is also right there, so they can look at it and go, I guess you can move your familiar afterwards, but I don't know, it just... Compared to Permanent, Frightened, and some of the other patron abilities, Silence and Snow, I just recommend skipping out on it. Clinging Ice is not good enough, and beyond the starting abilities, your patron does not grant you anything besides plot hooks. And that is a complaint I have with the Witch, is beyond level 1, and beyond what your GM helps write for you in the campaign, your patron doesn't matter. It matters because it gives you a hex cantrip, and that cantrip is going to be part of your regular, infinitely repeatable combat style. But unless your GM does something plot-wise with the patron you are serving, it doesn't do much. I hadn't really thought about it too much until I decided to make this video, but yeah, it decides your spell list, one skill proficiency, your familiar's ability, and your hex cantrip. But there's no, like, mid-campaign, high-level, mid-level class feature that augments the power of your patron. There's some other familiar abilities which are described as your patron giving your familiar the ability to do this, but there's no unique upgrade, for lack of a better term, to your patrons. You know, when you take the Starless Shadow Patron at level 1, your patron does not grant any new benefits as you level up, unless you accept the flavor that everything the witch gets is just from the patron. And even then, it doesn't feel great, because all of those benefits are the same regardless of which patron you pick. You get spells at the same levels, you get proficiencies at the same levels, all that jazz. It would have added probably an entire extra page to the book and would have made my deep dive a hell of a lot longer, but I think it would have been cool if there were specific patron lessons, not lesser, greater, or major lessons, but a unique lesson available only to each patron. Just make it like a level 10 feat, and it grants a new hex cantrip. That's it. It just grants a second hex cantrip for each patron. That'd be great. That would add, I think, 6 new hex cantrips, 6 options, make them not a direct upgrade from the starting cantrip, but make it new, you know? I think something like the Personal Blizzard lesson, even though I think it's terrible, would have been cool as a unique lesson only available to the Silence and Snow. You know, you hit level 10, your bond with your patron strengthens, so you get access to a whole new hex cantrip only available to that subclass of witch at level 10. That would be rad. Doesn't happen. Honestly, I have no idea why Paizo hates the cold hexes so much, and I'm sorry if I'm just beating the dead horse by talking about the 2 cold hexes all the time. They're just the biggest example of really not great hexes in the class. So as much as I love the flavor and the combat style and everything of the witch, the subclass doesn't feel like it does all that much. And this is not just the witch. The same thing can be said of some other classes where their subclass just determines how they start and doesn't change how they grow. Maybe that's just a me problem, maybe you don't care as much, but I do find that your subclass never coming back into play after level 1 feels like it invalidates the choice after a few level ups. Anyway, that's enough ragging on the patrons. Let's just move on to the feats, which I think is where the remaster just did the witch so good. The feats are what make the witch in this remaster. They're awesome, they're flavorful, but they're not overwhelming, which is very easy for Paizo to do. Some classes have way too many feats, fighter, and they just can feel like you're never gonna make the right choice. You know, if you've got 10 feats to pick from in one level, you're never gonna be able to pick just one. You'll feel bad if you feel like you made the wrong choice. The witch is right in the sweet spot. They've got like 4 or 5 options per level. A lot of them are good no matter what level you pick them up, so if there's no good option, the next time you get a feat, you can pick one of the ones from the previous levels. It feels awesome. And what they've done really, really well is that no single feat feels mandatory. A lot of people are going to fight that cackle is mandatory as a witch, but I don't think 3 free sustains per combat, while it is strong, I don't think that makes you inherently better than other witches. No, I think every single feat brings something to the table. You know, Cackle gives you free sustains. Cauldron gives you free consumables every single day. You know, Enhanced Familiar just gives you even more familiar abilities per day. You could have 6 familiar abilities at level 2. And Paizo could have easily made the lesson feats, the minor, major, and greater lessons, they could have made those way stronger. You know, they give you brand new spells unavailable anywhere else. Those spells could have broken the game and made it so that the lesson is the only good feat at levels 2, 6, and 10. And it's only the best feat at level 10. The Lesson of Death is way too good, I'm sorry. First off, the Hex spell, inflicting an actual curse which could deal theoretically infinite damage if they keep failing their saving throw, that is disgusting and absolutely nuts. And then, I was mistaken. When I first read that, I thought it gave you Summon Undead. No. It gives you Raise Dead. As in resurrection of a dead creature. That is a divine-only spell that you can get as any witch. You're an arcane caster witch? Take the Lesson of Death. You get raised dead as an arcane caster. How nuts is that? I think level 10's major Lesson of Death is way too strong, but there's only 2 major lessons. So Lesson of Life is really, really good, or whatever it's called, Lesson of Renewal. I think it's still very good. It's nowhere near as strong as Lesson of Death, because Raised Dead is busted. but I think it's really cool. Do they have anything else at level 10? I mean, it is competing with quickened casting, which once per day to cast like a whole extra spell per turn. That's great. It's competing with double for double your consumables every day. That's not bad either, but just, would you rather have 2 more potions per day? Or resurrection on demand? I guess it's not on demand because you still have to prepare it, but overall, crazy. But other than that, the feats are all very well balanced. Even their level 20 feats aren't that crazy. You know, the Baba Yaga house, I think it's really cool and flavorful. It's not strong. Well, a planar teleport, I guess, is pretty strong. But besides the planar teleport, you know, besides the ability to teleport across the planet, it's not that great. They've also done a great job of making sure there's an interesting feat at every single level. You've got the summon support with Rites of Invocation, you've got the Witch's Armaments right at level 2, you've got the melee support with the Sympathetic Strike at level 4, where you can whip someone with your mustache and then they're weaker against your hexes. I love that! Oh my god! I'm sure people are going to think I'm overreacting to this, and I probably am, but I'm such a flavor nerd. I know the witch is never going to have really good accuracy, and the higher level you get, the worse Sympathetic Strike is going to be, because the odds of you landing a normal hit with your 14 dexterity is not great. But I just love the idea of whipping them, cursing them, and making them more susceptible to my magic. My flavor is dripping. And Ceremonial Knife at level 6 is busted because it's missing one sentence that somebody pointed out in the comments of my deep dive, and I missed. It doesn't say, once you have imbued a dagger into a wand, it doesn't say like you make another one and that one disappears or becomes inert, or that they only last 1 day. If you've got 8 days of downtime and 8 daggers, you can just make 8 wands. And sure, they're limited because only you can use these wands, but that's still like, you've got a week of downtime? Cool. Without getting rid of any of your actual downtime, just during daily preparations, you get to make a whole extra one. God rest your soul, GMs, if you say, okay team, you've got a month of downtime, and your witch says, hey, can I buy 30 knives for 5 silver pieces? Okay, 30 knives would be 6 gold pieces, sorry, but you're level 6 with Ceremonial Knife. Would you trade 6 gold pieces for 30 free first level spell slots? That's just like 30 wands of Fear or Enfeeble or other spells that don't really care what level it is. Sure, Fear gets upgraded at like spell rank 5th or something. Also, I've been saying level this whole time instead of rank. I'm sorry, Paizo, please don't shoot me. But just having all these extra spell slots on wand daggers that can be overcharged. That's, if you make 30 daggers, that's not 30 free spell slots. That's 60 free spell slots. Remember, you can use a wand once per day and it's fine. You can use it a second time and then it has a 50% chance of breaking. Right at level 6, you can cast 60 spells in a day, and chances are you'll only lose half of your daggers if you had that month of downtime. I love this feat. Sorry I spent like 5 minutes talking about this feat, but it's so dumb and I love it. The Stitched and Spirit Familiar feats, I think, are rad, and they're even better than I said in the deep dive. People mentioned how, oh, these are new familiar abilities, not for the witch. So, in case you're unaware, you command your familiar just like an animal companion. You spend one of your player character's actions, and it gives your familiar 2 actions. So Stitched and Spirit Familiar technically only cost 1 action on the witch. So in the same turn, you could move your witch, use Spirit Familiar, and cast a hex, all for 3 actions. Crazy, the damage is great, they're only single target. I just wish Stitched was better than Spirit. And I think I know why it's weaker. Because Spirit is specifically only for divine and occult witches, and I think Paizo admits that the arcane and primal spell lists do inherently have more powerful options than Divine and Occult. Divine and Occult are plenty powerful, they still have great options, but they're a little more focused on conditions and support and buffs, whereas Primal and Arcane, they get your lightning bolts, they get your fireballs, they get your evocation out the butt to just blow up the battlefield that Occult and Divine are missing. So giving them a better familiar ability than the Arcane and Primal witches, I think is fair game. I sort of ripped on it in my deep dive, but in retrospect, I do think it's on purpose and it's deserved. I think that's also why, if you look at the patrons and their familiar abilities, they do reflect that as well. The Occult and Divine familiar abilities and hex cantrips have a bit more power than the Arcane and Primal ones. We already talked about Clinging Ice being garbage. The Arcane one's not that much better. It's cool and unique, but all the Arcane one does is let an ally get a +1 to a perception check to seek, and take that seek as a free action. That's all it does. It doesn't really help you in combat unless you're looking for something that's hiding. Meanwhile, like I said, the Occult Starless Shadow gets to inflict frightened with their familiar, and mixed with their hex cantrip can permanently keep somebody frightened. The Divine Patron gives temporary hit points every single turn when you sustain a hex, and just gives a flat damage bonus to allies as long as you sustain it. It's pretty dang good. So I think there was a conscious effort on Paizo's part to make the Divine and Occult patrons and familiar options more powerful than their Arcane and Primal counterparts, strictly because those spell lists are stronger. And the final feats I want to talk about are just the Cauldron feats. I think these are A+ design and should be looked at by a lot of people who might want to design some unique abilities for classes in PF2. You see, what the Cauldron feat does is it grants the Witch a little bit of Alchemist, but it doesn't do so in a problematic way. What do I mean by problematic? Well, if you look at Pathfinder 1st edition, all of the classes had an insane number of subclasses by the end of the system, and most of those subclasses were taking a different class and spiking it right into the base class. So, you'd become a fighter with some alchemist, or a wizard with some alchemist, or a shaman with some witch, etc., etc., to the point where every class felt like it was stepping on the toes of every other class. So how is the Witch doing this so much better? Well, it's adding a splash of Alchemist to the Witch in a way that doesn't step on the Alchemist at all. That's because the Cauldron feat can only be used to make oils and potions, very similar consumables to what the Alchemist can make, but oils and potions are specifically magical and not alchemical. So even though this uses very similar rules to how the Alchemist gets consumables every single in-game day, the Witch gets completely different ones, and the feats that expand upon the Cauldron are designed equally as ace. And that's because all of them have one prerequisite: the Cauldron feat from level 1. None of them have a requirement of the Cauldron and then the next feat and then the next feat to take this feat. No, there is no feat chain here because feat chains suck, and PF2 has avoided it in almost every way possible aside from very direct upgrades. Meanwhile, the Cauldron, you can get the one that lets you make a potion with a hex in it. You can get the feat that makes double consumables. I actually thought there were more feats than that. But still, both of those feats, albeit available at different levels, do not have each other as a requirement. All they require is Cauldron. And this leaves the room open for even more Cauldron feats in the future, and I think that is perfect. One base feat to unlock a bunch of other feats is great design. One feat to unlock one feat to unlock one feat to unlock one feat is terrible design. So, new designers out there, or people who are looking to expand existing classes, take notes from the Cauldron feat. It's a great way to sprinkle another class in there, do it differently, and if you're going to add more feats that expand upon it, make them all available, not a chain. So there's my 30-minute ramble about the Witch. Now, where does that leave us regarding the initial question? Is the Witch any good? And I think the answer is obviously yes. What does that mean, though? Obviously, every class is good, because your proficiency scales automatically, your numbers scale automatically. Unless you don't buy new equipment and tank your stats on purpose, you're gonna be fine. But the Witch is so customizable. The Witch can cast from any spell tradition. Granted, once you've picked, you are locked in for life. But their feats allow them to customize themselves in a great way. The lessons get you different spells that might not even appear on your tradition's spell list, like Raise Dead on an arcane caster. So mixing together all the different ways the Witch can cheat spells into their spell list, they're an incredibly versatile caster, obviously held back by the prepared spellcasting as a whole, but if you compare them to a wizard like people used to, they're not similar at all. The wizard is stuck firm in that arcane spell list, but even an arcane witch can have a ton of different spells from different spell traditions and use all of them on top of their super unique witch abilities to make potions, scratch people, hex them, all of this leading to such a unique class. And I believe that, yes, even when it comes to just raw numbers, the witch is phenomenal synergistically. On its own, I believe the witch is okay. If we're talking in a vacuum where someone can just do something to do damage, the witch is very rarely gonna be that person. Maybe they'll throw out a fireball or a lightning bolt, or at higher levels even a disintegrate if they can. Sure, but that doesn't make them any more special than the wizard. I think what really makes the witch special and is their most powerful feature are their hexes. Debilitating opponents, buffing allies, manipulating the battlefield, using their familiar ability. It's a lot. They can do a lot. So it's not going to be a simple class. If this is your first time playing Pathfinder 2e, I maybe don't recommend the Witch, because you're going to be controlling two separate characters with separate abilities while balancing two different types of spells, three if you can't hex cantrips and hex spells as different spells. The Witch is complicated. It's not like a kineticist or an oracle complicated, but it's more complicated than it looks on the surface. The Witch is no longer just another wizard. And I think the Witch is pretty damn good. That's a good way to end the video. Yeah, we'll end it like that. Cool. Lunch break, anybody? Anybody? Crew? Lunch break?